Are you sure? You're going to miss your favorite series. Yin spoke out as she sat on the sofa and looked at Sabito, who was busy studying at the dining table. He then kept quiet, and Yin let out a sigh as she shut off the TV and walked over to where he was. Aren't you going to watch TV? Don't mind me. He spoke out, and Yin frowned slightly as she looked at the pile of notes he was flipping through. And his textbooks as well. Nah, I don't feel like watching if you are not. She spoke out and looked towards his time. She then frowned as Sabito continued to pay attention to his notes instead, and Yin smiled softly as she patted him on the head. All the best for studying. She spoke out, and Sabito's arm slowly reached out and wrapped around her waist. He then pulled her in and nuzzled his face into her back, causing her eyes to widen. Hey! She yelled out and smacked him on the head, stomping back into her room as she was enraged at how his actions seemingly were towards her. Sabito then rubbed his head a little as he continued to look through his notes. Fuck, this is why I hate study breaks. I end up not knowing what to study for the stupid test. He mumbled out as he continued to flip through the notes, trying to figure out his life along the way. He then heard footsteps and looked as Yin came out of her room once more, and she set up her laptop onto the coffee table that was present. She soon watched as she walked over to where he was and grabbed a hold of his books and notes. Move over there. She spoke out, and Sabito looked at the time and wondered why Yin was still up. He then moved over and watched as she went to the kitchen, got out some energy drinks along with some fruit and snacks, which she brought over to the coffee table. What are you doing? You don't have to test to study for. Sabito spoke out, and Yin raised a brown response as she switched her laptop on and waited for it to load, twitching her eyebrow as it seemingly took forever. Doesn't mean I can't accompany you while you study, she spoke out, and Sabito could only let out a chuckle. Now he understood where Yin was coming from. Shaking his head in response, he leaned over and Yin flinched at the sudden closeness, which she then jabbed her finger against his forehead and pushed his head back. Just because I'm being nice doesn't mean you can invade my personal space. She spoke out, and Sabito chuckled as he reached out and patted her head. Thanks, I appreciate it. He spoke out, and Yin hummed in response as she started to work on her submission piece for the upcoming digital competition that she and Hakuji had enrolled in. She then looked toward the corner of her eye at how Sabito was smiling much more as he flipped through his notes, trying to find the things he needed to study for. I don't know you needed to study for. Yin spoke out, and Sabito let out a sigh then as he rubbed the back of his neck, trying to ease the ache that was rising from where Yin had slapped him earlier. I thought I didn't need to, he muttered out, and Yin laughed softly as she shook her head, reaching out as her small hand grabbed a hold of his shoulder, and she started to apply pressure. God, that feels good, he mumbled out, and Yin let out a sigh. Then she sat on the sofa, and soon Sabito lifted as he sat between Yin's legs on the floor and brought his notes over. He felt her fingers apply pressure at parts where his muscles were tensed up, trying to get him to relax as he chuckled, and Yin soon let out a huff. Tired, but she continued as she looked at her laptop where it was loading most of her artwork at a slow pace given how her artwork took up massive memory storage. So, how much do you need to study? Yin asked as she started to lightly hit him on the shoulders and peek over his head as she looked at what was on the notes. I don't understand, Yin mumbled out, and Sabito tilted his head, causing Yin to look down at him and smile. If I don't understand, what makes you unable to understand too? He asked, and Yin rolled her eyes in response as she stretched over and grabbed a hold of a piece of apple and shoved it into her mouth. Then try to understand, she spoke out, and she smiled gently at him and pushed his head back down as her hands found its way to the back of his neck where she started to apply pressure on it, trying to help reveal the tension. Then what are you going to do? Don't tell me you're just going to stay up until I finish studying. Sabito spoke out, and Yin hummed in response. Starting on the digital art that I'm going to submit for the competition. Yin spoke out, and Sabito hummed in response as he soon grabbed a hold of Yin's hand from where it was on his neck and brought it over, causing her arm to rest on his shoulder as he planted a kiss on the palm of her hand. Thanks. I feel better. He spoke out and turned to look at Yin, whose face was flushed red as she had an irk mark on her forehead. Can you stop? You're being creepy. At this point, you're going to surpass Doma in terms of creepiness. She spoke out, and Sabito only chuckled as he soon shook his head and let go of her hand. Okay, I apologize. Don't leave me for Doma. He spoke out, and Yin swore Sabito had a loose screw in his brain. The only time you can leave me is when we divorce. And Yin let out a sigh as she slammed the cushion against his face. Stop that nonsense and study before I request for a change of roommates. Yin spoke out, and Sabito chuckled as he continued with studying, as she went back to sitting on the ground right next to Sabito as she started her work. Okay, I'll study so that you won't have a divorce with me, he spoke out and chuckled as well. But Yin punched the side of his arm, which he chuckled once more at. Asshole, she muttered out, and Sabito could only shrug his shoulders in response as he looked through his notes and finally started to study. Yin, on the other hand, was reading through the brief of the competition, and her eyes widened, her lips parting slightly as she realized what the competition was about. Her eyes shifted towards where Sabito was. Her lips curled up into a smile as she started to fill in the information. And soon, she opened her software and connected her tablet, where she starts to do a rough sketch on the software. Yin then noticed how Sabito was writing with his dominant hand, and his other free hand reached out for the snacks as he picked up a piece of chip, which, his eyes not leaving the notes, he proceeded to angle his hand and poke the chip against her lips with ease, which she then parted him to took the chip. Given how she needed to have her hands on either the keyboard or the laptop or the tablet, and the duo sat in silence as Sabito studied and Yin was working on her project. The only sounds that were heard were the living room as the clock struck midnight, and the sound of papers being flipped, and the tic-tac of a keyboard keys being pressed upon, along with the sipping and munching that occasionally happened. Yin soon nodded as she looked towards the time on her laptop, and she noticed how late it was, close to 2 a.m. She then rubbed her eyes a little and noticed how Sabito was still delightingly studying. She got up, needed to use the restroom, and walked back into the bathroom after switching on the lights. Washing her face, she had gone to the toilet to do her business. She slowly walked out of the bathroom and into her room. Grabbing a hold of her blanket, she brought it out and soon walked over to where she had originally sat. You cold? We can higher the temperature of the air conditioning. Sabito spoke out, and Yin shook her head in response as she sat back down next to him. Nah, I just want something to keep me warm, she mumbled out, and she smacked Sabito on the arm once more when he turned to look at her. No, I don't want you to keep me warm. And Sabito burst out into laughter at the fact that Yin could tell what he was going to say out of his mouth. Idiot, she muttered out, just as she saved her work once more before continuing, and Sabito looked at her from the corner of his tired eyes as she worked diligently. A soft smile appeared on his lips as he could tell she was going to fall asleep soon. He yawned as he got up and headed to the bathroom as well, only to return and notice how Yin had fallen asleep as her head was tilted back, leaning against the seat of the sofa. Idiot, you shouldn't have stayed up with me when you could have gone to sleep earlier, he mumbled out when he poked her on the forehead gently. He sat down next to her and eventually shifted her to lay down instead, with her head resting on his thigh as he continued to study. Occasionally, he would have his free hand gently caress her cheek as she continued to sleep peacefully, with her lips slightly parted as he could only shake his head in response as he continued. And eventually, Sabito ended up falling asleep as his body leaned against the seat of the sofa, with his body pushing the coffee table forward by accident, and Yin's head shifted as his legs were stretched out, which caused the coffee table to be pushed further once more. He slowly opened his eyes to see if anything bad had happened, especially for her laptop, and soon shut his eyes when he noticed it was safe. Too tired to move, too tired to do anything, and due to sleep, well, they just stayed like that. His hand lay on her side as she continued to sleep peacefully. Unconsciously, his hand was moving as he gently caressed her side, and soon he fell into deep slumber. With the warmth radiating from Yin, he couldn't help but feel the wave of fatigue slowly taking over his body. Yin slowly shifted her head as she felt the strain on her neck. She slowly pushed her body up as she shook and stretched her neck, only to have her eyes opening slowly as she looked at what happened. Shaking her head, she looked at Sabito, who was sleeping soundly in such a position. She proceeded to stand up and use her blanket to cover his toned frame and yawned. She stood up slowly and walked towards the kitchen. Not sure why, but she decided to make breakfast before washing up. Eventually, she was done making breakfast, which was a simple breakfast at best, but it was something. And she yawned once more, heading towards the bathroom as she wanted to wash her face and brush her teeth. She grabbed a hold of her toothbrush and squeezed the toothpaste out of it, only to hear footsteps coming close. She then yawned before she started to brush and grab a hold of Sabito's toothbrush and squeezed a good amount of toothpaste on it, only to hold it out as Sabito had opened the bathroom door and his hair was messy, whereas he looked at what Yin was holding and grabbed a hold of it. The duo then stood side by side as they started to brush their teeth together at the same time, and as they bent down to spit into the sink at the same time, Sabito motioned for her to wash her mouth first, which she did, and she quickly washed her face and soon wiped it dry as she looked at Sabito, who, like always, was dozed off with a toothbrush in his mouth, and Yin gently patted him on the arm, which woke him up, and proceeded to wash his face and mouth as well. "Breakfast is ready," she mumbled out, and Sabito nodded his head and walked out with her from the bathroom as they headed back to the living room. Yin then picked up her phone and noticed the time, which was past 10 a.m. She yawned once more and watched as Sabito was already at the dining table, waiting for her to come over, which she did. "There isn't any class today. Why did you wake up so early?" Sabito muttered out, and Yin yawned out once more and covered her mouth. "Exhausted. My neck was aching. Figured that I should cook something for us too." "Not sure what time you would wake up," she muttered out, and Sabito nodded his head in response as the duo started to eat. Unknowingly to Yin, Sabito woke up when he felt Yin's warmth wasn't there on his thigh anymore, but rather a warmth around his body, which caused him to panic, only to realize that she had wrapped him around in her blanket and was missing from his side. I was supposed to go jogging, but Yin nodded. "I'm so tired." Sabito yawned out as well as he heard his phone vibrating, and he got up, walking over to where his phone was, and he noticed Sanemi was calling him. "Hello?" he muttered out, only for him to flinch, and Yin flinches as well, when Sabito had to put the phone away from its ear as Sanemi was yelling too loudly for this early in the morning. "Where the hell are you? We were supposed to be going jogging together, you piece of shit." And Yin couldn't help but laugh instead of how awake Sabito had now seemingly been. Okay, I'm coming. Don't yell already, you feline feral," he muttered out as he hung up, and Yin smiled as she looked at Sabito, who showed her an apologetic smile. "Sorry, I need to," he whispered out, and Yin nodded her head in response. "It's okay, go ahead. I'll clean up once I'm done," she said with a smile, and Sabito nodded his head and went to change into his jogging attire and soon left the apartment. Yin then looked towards the food that Sabito had yet to finish, and she let out a sigh as she stood up, placing it on the kitchen counter with ease since it was just next to a dining table, and walked into the kitchen. "Well, probably tell him to warm it up when he comes back." Yin mumbled to herself as she started to keep his food in the fridge. She then proceeded to wash her plate and bowls, and soon patted her hands dry, turning and walking into the living room to clear up any mess. When she was done, she had thrown the rubbish out, washed her hands once more, and headed towards where the balcony was. Pushing the curtains aside, she looked around and heaved a sigh of relief. As, I can't say this on YouTube, but something on the balcony. She then heard shouting, and she looked down at the balcony to see her eyes widening slightly. A smile appeared on her face as she rested an elbow on the railing and her head against the hand that was propped up. She watched as Sabito was jogging with his friends, who Yin recognized from the night before they had came over to stay, along with encountering them in the lift lobby. She then noticed Tengen was looking at her. He had a smirk on his face. Oi, Sabito! Look who's supporting you! And Yin looked around and noticed how there were many girls on the balcony, looking at the men who were jogging around. Given how they were all in sports studies major and were very popular for their bodies, and Yin looked as Sabito was jogging on the sports field, and he looked up to where Tengen was looking at, and his eyes widened as he waved. Yin then smiled softly, lifting her free hand and waving to him, watching him as he turned to continue jogging, and Yin yawned once more, not interested in the stares she was receiving from girls who were out on their balcony showing support for the boys. Who knows if they were anything. Turning to head back into the apartment as she shut the balcony door, she pulled the curtain shut. She then yawned once more as she sat back onto the sofa where she had neatly pushed the coffee table back and stacked Sabito's study notes properly. Ugh, I'm aching badly. Yin muttered out as she started to use her fist to gently hammer her aching shoulder and soon reached over to the back to massage her neck. Stupid Sabito. Shouldn't have stayed up for him, she mumbled out with a slight pout, and soon she let out a soft sigh instead. Well, let's hope that he did manage to study and remember some things, she muttered out, and eventually switched on the TV, as she tried to kill some time until Sabito returns.